Hey everybody, this is Cameron Abadi, one of the co-hosts of the show. There is no new data point this week. We instead will be re-airing one of the episodes from earlier this year, the one you might have heard it, maybe not. The first segment is about inflation that struck us as still relevant for obvious reasons. The second segment is about pasta trains. This actually was one of the first ideas that Adam and I came up with when we were conceiving this show. So it's about pasta trains and what those pasta trains say about the EU. Otherwise, we will be off next week, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all of that. But we will be back in your feed after that with new stuff. Maybe some familiar topics, obviously inflation, the pandemic is still around, but there's a French election coming up. Midterms we'll be talking about, I'm sure, in the US. I can also promise you there is a segment on the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the economics of the two rock bands. That's coming soon too. So anyway, we will leave it there. And see you on the other side of the new year. Okay, bye-bye. Welcome to Ones and Tooze, Foreign Policy's economics podcast. Every week we take two different data points. We tell you how they explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, joining you from Berlin, Germany. With us, as always, from his studio in New York is Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cameron. Good to be here.
Okay, so later in the show, we're going to be talking about pasta trains, and we'll tell you what they say about the European economy. But first, let's start with our news data point. This week, that number is 5, as in 5%. That's the rate of inflation in the United States as calculated by the Labor Department for the month of September. Basically, that means consumers are paying 5% more on average than they were a year ago for goods and services. That's higher than the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target, and that's started a lot of conversation.
Today we're talking inflation.
Prices are rising all across the country, and they're rising pretty quickly.
Inflation rising 5% since last year as the economy recovers, the fastest pace in nearly 13 years.
So is inflation really 5%? Is it transitory or persistent? Is this a new permanent condition? And is this level of inflation even a problem? Or is it maybe even a good thing? As usual, Adam, I want to start with a basic question. My recollection is that prices are set by the relationship between supply and demand. So if prices are going up, which side of that equation is responsible here? Is this a change in how much people are demanding or how much supply of stuff is available?
Well, certainly supply is playing a major role here. And you see that best if you break this number down that we're talking about. When you talk about inflation, we normally mean the Consumer Price Index, which is issued by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The aim of the CPI is to give you a handle on the cost of living of an urban household. So it includes food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, education, communications, all of those things. And right now, what we're seeing are some pretty huge disparities between these different components of the CPI. And that's kind of telling us that things are out of kilter on the supply side. So if you look, for instance, at food for American households, it's rising by only 3% year on year right now, whereas restaurant meals are up 4.7%. And I think we know from sort of just general reporting that eateries are having a huge problem getting hold of staff. But for real drama, you've got to look at the energy component. So whereas the prices for electricity generated within the US from your usual utility are up 5.2%, gasoline prices surged 42.7% year on year to August this year. And that just drags the whole index up with it. That huge leap is largely an effect of prices having been so low last year due to the collapse in the world economy.
I just want to quickly clarify, to the extent that there are all these supply disruptions, is this basically related to the pandemic? It sounds like it might be.
Pandemic is key for sure, because it threw everything out of sync. It disrupted the flows of goods, and then it produced this sudden restart, which was the only bit about this, in a sense, which has been synced. And that disparity has done a lot of damage worldwide.
Okay, so that's the supply side. It does seem like there are demand side issues maybe here as well. I mean, there have been several stimulus programs in the United States since the start of the pandemic. There are some big spending bills now in Congress that could pump even more money through the United States economy. The federal government has raised its minimum wage for government contracts. I mean, are all those factors also playing a role here?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, one of the most intuitive ways of thinking about inflation is to say, it's too much money chasing too few goods. And there's certainly more money in the system right now. But what's even more important is, in fact, that it's actually chasing the goods. So folks are actually out there trying to spend the cash. Consumer spending grew at an annualized rate of 12% in the second quarter of 2021. That's April to June. The crucial thing to understand about these kind of numbers in the US is that American statisticians annualize growth rates. So it's not that it will actually grow 12% over the course of the whole year. But if the rate of growth in that second quarter were to continue over a year, hypothetically, it would add up to a 12% increase.
Okay, so I get the argument for why this would be temporary or transitory, which it seems to be the word that people use when they're talking about inflation. I mean, we're talking about discrete causes that are rooted in the pandemic on the supply side and the demand side for what's triggering some of these issues. Those then presumably would eventually subside. But what's the argument for why this would be permanent or persistent? I mean, is it basically that there would be some kind of positive feedback loop so people are going to start expecting higher prices, so they start demanding higher wages, which leads to higher prices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, that's crucial because, I mean, if you take it very precisely, then you could insist that a process of price increases is only inflationary when it becomes permanent and self-sustaining. That's the only moment when you can really sensibly talk about inflation. Otherwise, the market's just doing its job, right? If supply and demand are out of balance, then prices need to adjust up or down. And once they've adjusted, the process stops. And then the rate of change, which is what we're talking about when we talk about inflation, falls to zero. So the question really is, how might a process become self-sustaining? Well, if we go back to our demand and supply thing, you could continuously add new injections of cash. But there's frankly little prospect of that. The Biden administration is having a hard enough time trying to get the latest round of stimulus through. And in many cases, they're actually paid for through higher taxation. So we may actually in 2022 face a sort of negative shock from the government side. That's one of the things I think the Democrats are worrying about. And there's certainly not much sign of runaway private credit creation. So that's the demand side. If you look to the supply side, what would a continuous restriction of supply look like? There's talk of energy wars, for instance, but we're not in a 1973 situation where OPEC is in the business of trying to, throttle the West. It's quite likely, really, that over the next couple of months, as oil prices pick up, output will pick up too. What we saw in the past, and I think this is what's really on people's minds, is in the 1970s in particular, a sort of institutionalized system where the expectation of inflation became institutionalized in what are called cost of living adjustments. And it was, in fact, with that process in mind that the CPI index was created in the first place 100 years ago, to manage the surge of inflation after World War I and to give trade unions and employers some sort of basis on which to bargain. And by 1976, as inflation surged again, starting in the late 60s in the Vietnam War, so-called COLA clauses, so cost of living adjustment clauses, covered 61% of the American workforce. So that really did create a considerable flywheel effect in which price increases would trigger wage increases, which drove costs up, which could then tempt employers and producers to raise prices again. So though there's a lot of talk about a sort of return to 70s era inflationary conditions, I think it would be frankly astonishing if what resulted from all of this was a sustained 70s style wage push campaign. I think that's really belongs to the realm of fantasy right now.
Okay, so this is partly about expectations, and you just gave, I think, a lot of plausible reasons not to expect this to continue to be a problem. But in this context, how are we supposed to understand the parade of people who've been coming out in public on TV saying this inflation really is persistent? I mean, by arguing that inflation is persistent, they're telling people to be worried. I mean, aren't they contributing to the problem? They're telling people to expect a problem coming up. So should we see this as a kind of attempt to work the refs? I mean, is this trying to influence the Fed, which needs to really decide what to do about all this?
Yeah, that's a great phrase. I'm going to steal that. The idea of them like being a bunch of belligerent players giving the refs a hard time, trying to intimidate that. I think that's spot on. In 2020, the Fed carried out a policy review and then announced that in future it would engage in what's called average inflation targeting. So it would aim not to stay below 2%, but at 2% on average. So that means they would allow overshooting as well as, aiming for some undershooting. And then to compound the uncertainty, think about the timing here. They announced this August 2020, and then the vaccines arrive, the stimulus begins to kick in, the recovery takes off, then we hit the supply chain bottlenecks. So we have demand, supply, and a policy shift all happening at the same time. And that's when the politics get serious. So you see the ref kind of uncertain about the call, and so everyone piles in to pick up your great image.
Yeah, I should say I used to work as a referee for young girls basketball, and I can confirm that working the refs works. I mean, I used to have parents.
Is the tape, Cameron? Is the tape? What we want to see is footage.
No. That's I didn't last long. Maybe because I was so vulnerable to the intimidation from the crowd. But in any case, I want to end with another basic question, which is, why exactly is inflation a bad thing? I mean, I get that people don't like higher prices, but if it all gets worked out in the end, that people eventually get more money in their paychecks, I mean, it gets harder to see the problem. I guess there's some friction of transition, but that should eventually work out. So it seems like the limiting case that people usually cite is that the economy is overheating if under inflation. But I've never known what that metaphor means in practice. What does overheating actually even look like?
Yeah, that's the thing about basic questions. They're often the best.
Well,
I mean, why is inflation a problem?
I'll take the compliment. I'll take it. I'll take it. I'm standing up for the reader here, or the listener here.
We need to ask. I mean, as you say, if it were universally expected and it was a smooth process of just adjusting ticket prices, it would be essentially painless. There might be kind of like a minimal extra cost of an administrative kind. It's what economists call shoe leather costs. It'd be trivial fundamentally. But the thing is that that's not generally how serious inflations play out. They're driven by the sort of thing we're seeing, painful supply shocks, or once upon a time in the 70s, by distributional struggles, clashes between workers and employers, which result in strikes. And they're often reflections of politics that have gone out of control and governments that can't manage their budgets anymore. And so in a sense, people fear inflation because they fear the causes of inflation. You could, however, say, and again, there's two sides to this argument. I mean, if you are in a society, a society burdened by huge debts, then a dose of inflation, either short and sharp or steady and moderate, may be precisely a way of achieving a rebalancing, because what it amounts to is basically a kind of tax, a kind of hidden, silent tax. And many serious economists, and I would support this position, thought before the crisis that we should really be aiming not for a symmetrical 2% target, but just flat out for a 4% inflation target. And that would actually be healthy. Certainly, it will be far better than the opposite, which is risking lowflation or even sliding into deflation when the tables are turned and it's the creditors who gain at the expense of folks who've borrowed money to invest in their businesses and educating their kids and so on, which is generally a recipe for recession and depression.
Okay, I'm glad I asked that embarrassingly basic question, but we have to leave it there for now. We will be right back. Welcome back to Ones and Tooze. Okay, so our next data point is from beyond the headlines. The number is 4. That's the number of dedicated trains that the Italian pasta company Barilla now operates over the Alps every week from Parma in the north of Italy to the German city of Ulm. Every one of those trains you just heard going over the Alps carries close to 500 tons of pasta, 60 tons of sauce, all of that sloshing over the mountains in those trains. It's not exactly the most appetizing thought, but that's how spaghetti and linguine and marinara gets from Italy and its factories to German plates. So not so long ago in 2020, it was 2 trains per week. But apparently, pasta has become really popular in the pandemic. Adam, do you want to hazard any guesses why that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think come the crisis, come the universal desire for comfort food. After all, practically every culture in the world has got some kind of pasta variant. And Barilla, they're just huge. They're the largest pasta company in the world. They ship staggering quantities of the stuff all around Europe and to the wider world. One important thing to say, though, Cameron, is that this stuff doesn't slosh over the mountains.
Oh, well, come on. Give me the liberty of the image. It's
The cool thing about it is it goes through the mountains. So Switzerland is really the crossroads of Europe. And what they struggle with is an absolutely endless, unceasing day and night convoys of thousands and thousands of trucks driving through their country, polluting, killing pedestrians, wildlife. I mean, the roads in Switzerland at peak season are just absolutely hellish. So what they've done, with typical Swiss ingenuity, is they've burrowed these enormously expensive, extremely high-tech tunnels through the Alps. And that's what the trains run on. That's really the Barilla boast, that the pasta trains are going to save 5,000 truck trips per annum. It's going to take 6,000 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it's win-win-win, right? It's a marketing shtick, it's a logistics win, and it's an environmental win, and it saves the poor old Swiss from being swamped by trucks.
Okay, so I'll admit I was thinking of something more dramatic, like the trains crossing the Alps, like Napoleon crossing the Alps.
Yeah, or like Hannibal's elephants or something. No, the tunnels are totally amazing. And we should definitely do a segment about these awesome feats of engineering. They have these rotational diggers that plow their way through the Alps and steered by super high precision GPS. So you tunnel from two sides and they burrow towards each other, obviously in the dark through the granite, and they meet with like centimeter tolerance in the middle of the mountains. And then I think they abandon the machines forever lost inside the mountains. It's mind-blowing stuff.
Okay, I'm going to make a note of that. I think we can do that as a segment some point soon. But for now, these trains, the pasta trains, they're being operated by this pasta company, as you're describing. I just can't help but contrast that investment in German train logistics from an Italian company with all the headaches we've been hearing about in Britain recently. I mean, sometimes it seems like they're having trouble getting food across their borders from Europe. We were even hearing about seafood rotting in ports. They have supermarket shelves empty in Northern Ireland. I mean, are these pasta trains in Europe, are they a window into what exactly the European Union is?
Yeah, this is the secret sauce.
Oh no, that's
it's the sort of trade that's absolutely the key to what Europe is. I mean, these paths across the Alps, I mean, they literally are trodden for centuries. We can, in fact, find the dung, we think, of Hannibal's elephants deposited on the approaches. They're the routes which have been crossed by great armies in the past, always by traders. And so what we're seeing is like this sort of typical European blend of the latest in engineering and just-in-time logistics with truly ancient trade routes. Barilla has the world's largest pasta factory just outside the town of Parma, and they also have a huge sauce factory there. And the whole thing is fed by Durham wheat, which is delivered to the ancient port city of Ravenna, one of the capitals of the Roman Empire in its declining stages. So very old trade routes, souped up, perfected, optimized for the 21st century.
So I wonder if in a longer historical sweep, the pasta trains also tell us something about how the EU single market affects European culture. Germany has traditional cheap food of its own, right? I mean, sausages and the like. I'm guessing the fact that pasta sales have been booming for years in Germany, I mean, that has at least in part something to do with the indirect effects of the single market, right? I mean, starting with decades of northward immigration from Italy.
Yeah, I mean, let's not knock German cuisine. They have pasta too.
I mean,
so they've got egg noodles,
I know.
They've got Spätzle,
yeah,
which are great with Swiss cheese and onions. And then they've even got their own type of stuffed pasta, which, believe it or not, are called Maultaschen, which literally translates as like mouth pockets.
Yeah. That may make it less appetizing. Let's stick with Maultaschen.
They're very good. Fat sort of ravioli with spinach and mystery meat. But yeah, European food culture has definitely become more unified over the last half century. If Americans like Julia Childs brought French food to the US, there's very similar processes in Europe as well. In Britain, it was a woman called Elizabeth David, whose cookbooks people may know from the Mediterranean. She basically introduced fresh garlic to the Brits. If you actually watch Len Deighton's films, the ones with Michael Caine from the 1960s, show a working class Brit learning to cook fancy European food. It's really kind of touching to watch. And the wars stirred things up. You get a rash of Italian cafes all over Northern Europe after World War II. Many of them are Italian prisoners of war. It was still very much happening in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up in West Germany. I vividly remember the shock of first trying pesto, like green and silky and kind of oozier than you can possibly imagine, all that olive oil and dried tortellini, which I remember stealing from some sort of highway Italian restaurant. Yeah, it's a story of guilty pleasures accumulating over time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing one reason that Germans might prefer the spaghetti and the tortellini to their local pasta is that when they talk about it, they hear the word mouth pocket, as you were just talking about. So, you know, I guess I would prefer to go with the pesto and the tortellini. But one last thing about the pasta trains. I was saying that I was reading all this PR material from Barilla, and to go back to the thing you mentioned at the outset, I mean, the company emphasizes everywhere that this train service in Germany is not just about serving a foreign market. It's also a climate change measure. I mean, they emit less carbon than the trucks they used to use. But I mean, how seriously should we be taking this? Is this just like PR greenwashing, so to speak?
There's an element of that for sure. I mean, this is a profit-making company. But it's also significant, isn't it, that the context makes this worthwhile, right? That this is a kind of PR that actually works. I mean, they are selling you your pasta and tomato sauce, like, you know, everyday evening family food as a contribution to tackling the climate crisis. It's quite something, really. There's a real point here because Europe is, you know, a champion of climate policy, and one of its boasts is that its CO2 emissions, its carbon dioxide emissions, have been actually going down. But the one sector that has bucked that trend, where emissions have gone up over recent decades, is transport. In fact, they've gone up by a third since 1990, which is really bad news. If you've ever had the chance to visit, you'll know the Europeans are actually, you know, absolutely addicted to cheap, short-distance flying. But road transport and trucking are also major contributors here. Altogether, transport accounts for about 29% of European emissions. And of that, trucks and buses are about 5%. So anything that moves pasta shipments from the road, where you're burning diesel, to rail, when you can use electricity, and the electricity then can, of course, be generated from renewables, wind or solar, or in the case of Switzerland, it would be hydroelectric. Any of that's a win. And we need more and more stories like this.
Okay, you heard it here first. Pasta trains are not only an engine of a world historical project in the form of the EU single market, but they're also a way of saving the planet. Okay, that does it for another episode of Ones and Tooze. I'm Cameron Abadi.
And I'm Adam Tooze.
Our podcast is a production of Foreign Policy. Our show is written by me and Adam. It's edited by Laura Rosbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Dan Efron is the executive editor for podcasts at FP. We're a few weeks into this. We've been getting great responses from folks online. Keep it coming. You can write to us through our email address. That's podcasts@foreignpolicy.com. Or try us through our Twitter feed. That's @OnesandTwozePod. As always, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple or your favorite podcast app. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.